Good evening, everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome you this evening to the George Washington University, where tonight we are investigating and discussing a very interesting topic. We're discussing women in international business, but what I think is a very sort of provocative question to ask. And we have an amazing group of speakers and panelists, I think, to discuss the topic. Why organizations need to invest more in women. We are joined tonight for our keynote address by award-winning author and international career expert Stacie Berdan. And as you can see from the handout that I know you received at the front, an amazing list of panelists from the private, the public, and the NGO sectors, really to give us, I think, a wide-ranging perspective about the international experience of women in the workplace and really the value that women bring to those workplaces in the global marketplace. Tonight's event is sponsored by George Washington's School of Business, as well as its Center for International Business Education and Research. The U.S. government has recognized George Washington University as a center of excellence in the field of international business by the funding and creation of this Center for International Business Education and Research, GW-CIBER. And I would like to extend a special thanks to the staff of GW-CIBER for organizing all the logistics around this particular event. Without further ado, let me introduce for you the Dean of the School of Business at George Washington University, Dean Doug Guthrie.
Thank you, Dean Riddle. It gives me such great pleasure to welcome you all here to this venue. It's one of the great things that universities do, and it's one of the great opportunities and moments that we have is to come together with people who are engaging both in intellectual and pedagogical projects, but also those who are practitioners in the world who think deeply about topics that we care about and that we're passionate about. At the George Washington School of Business, we think very deeply about and care very much about thinking of building a community that's really about the intersection of business and society and really thinks deeply about core topics that are crucial to how to make businesses successful, how to make society successful, and how to help a healthy capitalist economy. One of the issues, of course, that I think is crucial and we have lots more work to do on is the role of women in the workplace and women leadership. We're actually we've been thinking about this topic a lot lately. We're soon going to announce a program that has to do with the elevation of women in corporate boards and how to think of that from an executive education perspective. But that's just one tiny piece of the puzzle of an issue that really needs to be tackled aggressively and we need to continue thinking about deeply. Now, it's my great pleasure to actually work with institutions like Dean Riddle mentioned, like GW-CIBER, and they are sort of the flagship type of center that we have at GW that really pushes these topics forward. It gives me great pleasure also to welcome a very esteemed panel and a keynote speaker who is not only a best-selling author on this topic, but a world-renowned thinker on the issue of women in careers. Stacie Berdan has been working on this issue for many years. Her first book, Get Ahead by Going Abroad, I haven't read, but given my interest in really pushing students out the door and sending them off to places like China, it sounds like a book that I need to read. And so I'm looking forward to digging into the substance of it. Without further ado, let me turn the stage over to our keynote speaker. Thank you, Stacie.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Dean Guthrie, as well as thank you to the George Washington University, to CIBER, to all the faculty, staff, professors who have actually welcomed me so warmly here several times, and to all of you for coming out on this gorgeous Washington, D.C. evening. It's good to be back on the GW campus again. I've been here several times, and it's a city that I love because I actually started my career here. After graduate school, I moved from South Florida, came to D.C., found a job with a big international public relations giant, Burson Marsteller, where I worked hard and I constantly pushed for an international assignment because I really, really wanted one. It came after a lot of pushing and patience. 5 years later, I was sent to Hong Kong. I got married the day before I left, honeymooned in India along the way, worked in Hong Kong for 3 years, had a fabulous time, made some great friends, really fast-tracked my career, moved up the corporate ladder, eventually moved back to DC, and along the way I had twin daughters, because that's what happens in life sometimes, a little wonderful and unexpected surprises. And then moved from Burson in-house to Unilever, where I worked for a few years because I thought it was really important to understand the corporate side, and then left and worked on this international careers issue, all based on an idea with one of our panelists about women working abroad, actually being able to fast-track their career. So for the last few years, that's what I've been doing, writing, speaking, and really counseling and encouraging all people, women especially, yes, but all people, to really develop a global mindset because it's critical for the future. And I wouldn't be standing here today if I didn't have international experience and if I didn't have support and investment along the way throughout my career. You know, I was lucky. I had two great bosses early in my career. One woman who took me under her wing and said she was going to teach me absolutely everything I needed to know, which she did, I think. And then another who saw the value of the international career space and really was an advocate for me and helped me launch my career internationally. And it made a huge difference. You know, I always think about how much support I received throughout my career, so I ask that all of you remember the people that help you now, and for those of you actually who are in a position to help, because it really does make a world of difference, especially in this space. And so I continue to give back to others because it does really matter, and it's one of the passions that I have, especially because now, as I mentioned in the beginning, it's critical to develop a global mindset and for so many of us to understand the workings internationally. So for tonight, I'll be sharing some thoughts with you in the beginning about globalization, women, and international careers. Then we'll move into our panel discussion, which I believe will prove to be insightful, informative, and hopefully even funny, because I know some of the panelists pretty well, who will share their perspective on being global international women. So globalization, and global is everywhere today. You can hardly turn on the TV without seeing the rapid changes and things going on. Our world is so much more interconnected than it's ever been, and it's even more so you know, as the days and the weeks and the months go by. And with large international events such as the global financial crisis of a couple of years ago, it really showed how interconnected we were. So I want to start this off with a little bit of a video, if I can play that now. interconnected, very competitive world that we live in. So on the scary side, since global is everywhere, on the scary side we read about global warming, global population growth, epidemic outbreaks that now must be evaluated on a global scale. We face the fact that the global financial crisis was sparked in part by at least how interconnected we were and how we saw things crumble around the world, and how we watch India, China, Brazil, and so many other countries around the world actually recover much faster than we are. We witness Americans streaming overseas for jobs, similar in ways that maybe some of our grandparents and parents did coming here. Yet the positives of globalization are also legion. We watch global sports and cultural events. We buy inexpensive imported goods. We watch and enjoy globalization through music, art, movies, food. And so we know that the same interconnectedness that can cause global crises can also bring about local miracles, like tiny fair trade craft circles selling products around the world by blog, democracy protesters sharing information on Twitter, and banks raising micro-business startups via internet penny investors. So there are pros and cons, but whatever you think about it, it's here now, happening faster, and we actually have to learn to deal with it. Employers understand it better than others, and I think a lot of the fast tracking that occurred, accelerated global growth occurred during the financial crisis because things weren't recovering as much here, and so many companies were forced to expand a little bit faster internationally. And in our ever-shrinking global world, international experience is really critical to actually moving ahead in your career. It's moving from a nice-to-have to a must-have in your career experience. And increasingly, the ability to work globally and cross-culturally may make the difference between a good career and a super successful career, as in the past, or possibly a decent career and a not-so-decent career if you don't have it at all. Faster recovery outside the U.S. is further complicating the picture. There we go. The fastest growth is not necessarily coming from the plum markets of the UK, Switzerland, Germany. And so many students will say, well, I really want to work in Paris. I really want to work in Rome. Well, I've been wanting to work in Rome for about 20 years, and it's really difficult to get a job in Rome. I have no EU passport. I don't speak Italian, and the economy really isn't that strong right now. So you really need to look at the world differently if you're interested in an international career these days. Maybe 15 or 20 years ago, it was much more common because growth was occurring throughout Europe, but now it's much harder. So even just the BRIC countries, which are growing, are great, but there's a lot of activity around that. So really think seriously and smartly about where else there might be some growth. Because there's a lot of growth outside the BRICS, UAE, Turkey, Ghana, Nicaragua, Panama. There's so much growth going on, so really take a look at that. But globalization affects all types of workforce. And many people say, well, it's just for business, right? But no. A pharmaceutical scientist may end up in a new research lab in India. Digital media experts may be doing social media in China with bilingual facing consumers. Engineers may be tapped to work in the big offshore oil drilling off the coast of Brazil. And the possibilities are endless. So the smarter you think and the greater outside the box that you think about international careers, I think the better chances you have of actually exploring. And the same for true as employers. It's not just the markets. But a lot of people also think it's just big multinationals. But it's not just the big multinationals of North America and Western Europe. A lot of it now is maybe the large multinationals in China, India, Brazil that are expanding around the world. But it's also public sector, in addition to private sector, academia, not-for-profits, NGOs, all of them are play an increasingly important role in the international space. And so that's the global picture in a very quick, short nutshell. And now what I want to do is talk about the women and why it's important. Investing in women is an idea whose time has come. As you can see, a lot of the activity going on around women. As an example, the World Economic Forum at Davos now hosts a forum on women as the way forward. The Joint Economic Committee of the U.S. Senate prepared a study called Invest in Women, Invest in America. There's a large consulting firm that developed a position paper on the gender dividend, subtitled Making the Business Case for Investing in Women, and on and on and on. You see a lot of this going on. More generally, research continues to emerge from private sector that companies are earning good business returns in the form of better employees, stronger markets, and stable growing economies from investments in women in the workplace. Philanthropy aimed at girls and women is having high impacts on tough social problems, from poverty to the environment. And many organizations are finding effective ways to invest in the world's female population. These philanthropic investments can make a big difference. These programs and policies that benefit girls and women can improve maternal and child health outcomes, end violence against women, break barriers to women's political participation, and so on. But to date, only about 10 to 12% of philanthropic endeavors actually are focused on women and girls alone. And those are going up, but they're not going up fast enough. And they really need to increase in order to actually affect deep and meaningful changes in the space. But fortunately, the people who are investing most in these women around the world are other women. Thanks to higher levels of education and in turn higher incomes, women are actually beginning to invest in other women here and around the world. And statistics show that women actually give at every single income level, on average, more than their male counterparts. So that's a good thing. So women are investing in women. Advocating for the investment in women by companies and NGOs and not-for-profits, this has been going on for a while, and people have been saying this. But the discussion lacks at least still one critical piece of, or one critical push, and that's growing women internationalists. Of course, country-specific efforts like the programs I talked about are important, and they deserve great support, but we also need another level investment, and that's in women leaders, women business executives, in order to help women fully participate in the next generation of leadership. Because, make no mistake, we need more women leaders here and around the world. Women bring a fresh and perspective approach to business, to thinking. And research in both the US and Europe shows that companies show that gender diversity is on their radar, actually more than on their radar, that they really believe in it. Yet when push comes to shove, it's not always put into action. But women as leaders, there's a new piece of research that just came out that was published in the Harvard Business Review and by Jack Zenger and Joseph Folkman that indicated that women are clearly better leaders. I don't know if anybody read that, but it's fascinating. There were 7,300 people. They asked men and women, managers, leaders, people throughout the organizations. And of the 16 traits that they asked of leadership, women scored anywhere from 2 to 10 or 11 percentage points higher than men on all of these traits. And not just the touchy-feely nurturing, all the ones that we're usually attributed with, which are great, but all of them. But it's still no secret that the vast majority of leaders are men, 64% in the leadership position. And when women outside the study were asked, why is this? Why do you have all these great leadership, but still 64% are men? Very sad, painful responses, especially from a lot of the women that I know. Here are a couple of quotes. Well, we need to work harder than men to prove ourselves. So of course, we're going to be treated as better because we never let our guard down. We never stop. We always push the extra mile. Another is we feel the constant pressure never to make a mistake. But the other interesting piece of the research is that despite all this, great pressure, leadership, women still have better balance in their lives, which is kind of amazing, especially with some of the women that I know. So women's leadership in the boardroom is really important. It's proven to be a boon for the business's bottom line, and having diverse decision makers matters in academia, NGOs, not-for-profits, and the public sector. And in today's complex and interconnected world, we really do need leaders with diverse international perspective as well. But despite so much focus on women leaders, and globalization, there still is not enough international women. There's such a rarity of women with international experience, actually, that in the book that my co-author Perry Yateman, who's here tonight, and I wrote, Get Ahead by Going Abroad, women can really fast-track their careers by differentiating themselves and actually pushing forward because they have experience that so many others don't have. Sorry, I'm having a clicker issue. So, in the research that we did, we interviewed more than 200 successful international women. And they said that 85% said that going overseas can fast-track your careers. 78% said a significant impact on compensation. Plus, you can get great challenging assignments, higher degree of job satisfaction, the respect of your peers, notice, and a really fun, cool, interesting life along the way as well. But we also discovered that there are other things oops, hold on. There are other things that were common to all of these successful women internationalists. There are a couple of points. One is that there's no right time or situation, and that's a question that a lot of people ask. Although younger, earlier may be better because you have less baggage, but there really, any time in your career, try to aspire to international experience. Sometimes right when you finish school, you may have debt. It may not be as easy to take the assignment. So always think about it and keep it on your radar, even if it doesn't happen right away. And you can do it. You know, you'll need to develop a strategy. You'll need to be focused. You'll need to be disciplined. But actually with hard work, dedication, and constantly pushing, you actually can make it happen. And it takes plenty of work and persistence. It took me 5 years. I was banging on the door constantly. Some people go right away. Some people it falls into their lap. And that's another interesting and kind of unusual thing about international careers. And the other, that's become mostly because of technology, is an international career doesn't have to mean living and working abroad for many years. It was and has been for many years, but a lot of jobs can be based here in DC, New York, San Francisco. You're part of global teams, you're part of an international team, and you can have an international career that way as well. But there's another reason to invest more in women, internationalists. We're good at it. According to the research that we did, that Perry and I did, that there are at least 5 traits, and this kind of mirrors what I like about the research that we did, is actually mirrors a lot of the global mindset research that's been done out of Thunderbird. There are different types of traits, and when we asked more than 200 successful internationalists a list of 12 or 13 traits, which ones do you attribute to your success? Overwhelmingly, these 5 emerged to the top. Adaptability or flexibility, excellent communication skills, team and relationship building, patience, perseverance, and curiosity. And those are all really important to actually international careers. In addition to the interpersonal skills, our research showed that many times women can benefit from the halo effect. Just because we show up, many people assumed, and so many women in the research that I did said this, people would say, oh, well, you're a woman. You must be the best if they sent you. For why else would they send you? Right, absolutely. Just go with it if that's what they say. Yeah. So it's time more organizations, public, private sector, all types, invested in women internationalists. Here are a few of outstanding international women across all sectors. And the international experience that global managers bring to the business table and workers bear on business is critically important to global growth. Women's skills at communication and inclusion can actually bring this message back throughout the organization and make a difference. Women executives, especially those with international experience, tend to reach out well to the vast market of global consumers. And we know that, researchers estimate that by 2014, worldwide, women will control $28 trillion in that consumer spending, yet so many of the marketing and the initiatives are actually directed by men, and they still feel offended by it, not reached properly. And so I think it's time that more internationalist women start leading teams, trying to understand what global women want and how to better serve the women who are their most important market. Business schools have recognized the importance, which is great to see. I speak on campuses across the country, and everybody does not have the same type of global mindset nor approach. You're lucky because here at GW, it's an amazing, a real leader actually in this space. As Professor Riddle gave me a quote from my second book, Go Global. She said, students, international business students cannot learn how to do international business without doing international business. So as part of the Global MBA program, students go on assignments around the world, working with local companies, learning how to do business locally. And the teamwork that's involved, the consumer angles, all the different elements, the economics, the currencies that are affected, and they learn through doing, makes a really big difference. Unfortunately, I think for US-based organizations, many have not yet fully realized the importance, even though everyone says, yes, globalization is important. Yes, we need more women leaders, but we're not putting 2 and 2 together. A recent Catalyst survey found that 72% of executives agree gender diversity is important, but when push came to shove, only 28% listed it as a must-have. Research that's been done on human resource executives around the country have shown that they are 4 times as likely not to send a woman overseas. And there's no real rationale or reason given, maybe not going to do as well, or what about your spouse, what about your family? And women have been asked crazy questions when we've raised our hands for international assignments that men, I don't think, are asked in the same way. And one of the most recent surveys that I read was done by a big international executive search firm, well respected. They did it on the importance of foreign language proficiency, international experience to landing a big job. But actually, when I went to look, I thought, oh, this is great. I haven't seen anything like this before. I'm so glad a search firm's looking at this. But I went to look at the profiles, and wouldn't you know that the 15 or 16 pictures all looked alike. No gender diversity, no racial diversity. They kind of even looked around the same age, you know what I mean? So it's like, whoa, maybe they had different ties on. But it really wasn't very, so they did this great body of research, and then I could just see men writing the report and saying, what's wrong with all these people in the pictures? But there was nothing there, and it was really sad because, they talked about women and all these various issues and gender diversity, but it wasn't in their report. So if organizations, I don't really understand how this could be other than people really don't have international experience. And that's something that I run into all the time, whether I'm standing on a soapbox at my children's middle school talking about the importance of foreign language and learning earlier and starting in kindergarten and not starting in high school, or I'm speaking on college campuses to MBA students about the importance. If we don't invest more in women internationalists, we're missing so many chances to develop the next generation of women executives, women leaders who actually can take us into this global world, in my opinion, in a much better way, or at least a more expanded way, if you will. And that's true for business, government, not-for-profits, NGOs, and academia. We know that investing in women works, but our actions don't always keep up with, our actions don't always keep up with what we know we really need to do. Women internationalists who appreciate the importance of investment can be the best advocates for others. And that's why we've invited 6 dynamic, funny, fabulous, wonderful women here tonight. Here they all are. And you all have pictures of them in their bios, so I'm going to introduce them a little bit. But our panelists all do have significant international experience across a wide range of sectors. And they've scaled great heights, overcome all kinds of obstacles in their career, probably had lots of personal and professional triumphs and losses along the way as well. And they know that organizations need more women in leadership roles with international experience. So they're here to share their stories and give some advice. And by being here tonight, they are investing in women as well, just as GW is investing in women. And so I'd like to take a few minutes to introduce you to our panelists. They're going to come on stage one at a time. And we're going to start, what we're going to do is we're going to go into a series of questions that we'll ask them one at a time. And then we're going to open it up for, oh, they've gone. They've bolted. We're going to ask them a series of questions and then open it up to the floor for about 30 minutes or so. And then I'm going to save a little bit of time at the end to ask them to give one more parting piece of advice, words of wisdom to all of you. So come up with some questions because there's going to be some time to do that. And without further ado, I will introduce them one at a time. Here is the first one, Tammy Overby. She's the Vice President for Asia, U.S. Chamber of Commerce. She's responsible for developing, promoting, executing programs and policies related to the U.S. trade and investment in Asia. She works closely with chamber member companies, business coalitions, AmChams, government leaders, and business executives to achieve their business objectives in this vastly growing region. She lived and worked in South Korea for 21 years as a woman. Maria Peña, she's the Senior Director for Entrepreneurship and Economic Development for Vital Voices Global Partnership, not-for-profit. She leads their economic empowerment work globally, focusing on the growth of women-led small and medium-sized enterprises and the development of networks and business women's organizations in the Middle East and North Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Asia Pacific. Prior to this position, she worked at Ernst & Young. Penny Tam, Head of Compliance of the International Finance Corporation. She just started there in February. I think she's glad to be back here in DC. She's a lawyer and a senior compliance officer. Before joining the IFC, she had a distinguished career in the private sector as the global head of regulatory risk and compliance for the Global Banking Markets Division of the Royal Bank of Scotland in London. Prior to that, head of Asia compliance for ABN AMRO in Hong Kong. She's lived in Vancouver, London, Singapore, Hong Kong, now DC. Debbie Tsai. She's a partner at KPMG. She served in a variety of client roles over her 17-year career. She was made partner at KPMG US in 2007, and she's currently an audit partner on the World Bank Group. She has significant experience serving large, complex, multinational companies, public and private, and in particular engagements with substantial international coordination and cross-border issues. She's fluent in English, Spanish, and Chinese. Mary Walsh, she's a division manager, Airports New England region for the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration. It's a new position she just accepted this past November. Mary's a highly experienced civil aviation professional with a comprehensive understanding of civil aviation procedures, current objectives, and future challenges. Prior to her current assignment here in Boston, she served as a senior FAA representative to Southeast Asia based in Singapore, where she was responsible for the agency's efforts to strengthen safety and promote procedural and system harmonization in a geographical area that ranged from Thailand all the way down to New Zealand and Australia. Previously, she was the first female manager of the FAA International Security Office in Singapore. So she was in a double man's world there. And Perry Yateman, who is the Senior Vice President, Corporate Affairs, Kraft Foods, and the President of Kraft Foods Foundation. For the past 5 years, Perry's been a key advisor to Chairman and CEO Irene Rosenfeld, leading Kraft's corporate communications, community involvement, and global public policy. From multi-billion-dollar deals, including the recent Cadbury acquisition, to spearheading Kraft Foods' first ever Global Week of Service, Perry has successfully used the disciplines of corporate affairs to help drive the company's agenda, internally and externally around the world. And as I mentioned, she's the co-author of Get Ahead by Going Abroad. She has extensive international experience moving from Baltimore to Singapore to Moscow to London, back to Connecticut, then to Chicago, and back to Annapolis, all over the place. So she has extensive international experience as well. So please join me in welcoming the panelists. Okay, so I'm going to come up with some questions. First one is we're just going to talk about globalization. So what impact has globalization had on your business? I'd like to start with Debbie.
Okay. Good evening. Thanks for being here tonight. I'm very happy to be able to sit on this panel with really all these wonderful women. In terms of, I think, what globalization has had on my particular business with a large accounting firm, I think it's been huge. It's made us needing to react much faster, much more interconnected. And you heard earlier in terms of how Stacie said that going abroad usually will fast track your career. I will tell you that I've been with the firm for 17 years. So 14 years ago, one of the key partners in my first office, which was in Vancouver, Canada, told me that for anyone who one day would like to be in leadership in any organization, by the time you're getting there, having international experience is absolutely critical. And that's 14 years ago. And as we all know, since then, the world has really just exploded in terms of how global it has become. And I like to think, I'm a global citizen, and I don't say that from an arrogant perspective at all. I think of it as meaning that hopefully I'm more aware of and more adaptable to just the different cultures, their similarities and their differences. And that's really how I think it's really impacted my organization and our business. So to be successful and to be able to react fast, you really need to be able to understand what other people across the world in different time zones are thinking. And to be able to do that, you could learn about it in school, you could study, you could read books, but nothing really beats, whether it's getting on a plane, visiting there, or even better, living there, for different cultures and to be exposed to just different countries and different people. So I think that's what's really changed businesses. It's really essential to be able to say, I've been there, I've seen that, and I'm open to it, and I know how to deal with it.
That's great. Tammy, do you want to add?
Sure. With the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, we cover the world. We have a division at the Chamber, about 70 people, and literally we have people on every continent. And I would echo what my colleague and friend Debbie just said about time zones. It may seem small to a lot of people when they say, let's coordinate a call with different organizations around the world, but as somebody who lived in Asia for over 20 years, I can't tell you the number of times I had to get up at 2 or 3 a.m. to make it convenient for the people living in Washington who apparently don't understand that the rest of the world does not all operate on DC time. So there are really so many facets and components to being global and going global, and it affects everything. And I commend you all for being here, because so many people don't realize 95% of the world's consumers live outside the United States. So it's only going to become more important going forward. So kudos to all of you. You should get an A.
That's great. Would anyone else like to add to that? No, that's good. Next question, how did you land your first international assignment? And was it planned or unplanned? Mary?
Mine was very unplanned. I was with the FAA. My background is explosives and corrosives. So that means that
Get out of the country.
Yeah, not the usual track. So when I broke up with guys, I always got nice jewelry. They were afraid I'd get after them, afraid to get in their car. But I was doing some cryptology for the government, and we had Pan Am 103 go down in Lockerbie, Scotland, and they wanted to know, they needed people to help identify wreckage. So they said, who has some forensics background? It was 1989, and I raised my hand, and I went to Lockerbie for 3 weeks and sat in a hangar and went through salvaged wreckage to identify explosive components and damage to the plane, which was uniquely explosive. So that was my first step in traveling internationally for the government. And when I came back, I never went back to my old job. They said, we'd like to keep you in the international arena. So I was very content being in Washington, D.C., traveling back and forth, going for long assignments. And I always raised my hand for the more difficult ones, the Haitis and the Lagos, Nigerias, because I found that when you go to Switzerland, it was fantastic and really nice, but I didn't learn anything. And when you take a Haiti or Lagos, Nigeria, you're going to learn a lot. So I always raised my hand for those kind of experiences. And then when the real big opportunities came along, I was the first one that they thought of. So I was sitting at my desk. I had just built a house in a townhouse in Kingstown, Alexandria, and for 6 months I bring it in, this is my countertop and this is my wallpaper, and then they came in and they go, I had just closed and I was in there for 3 days, and they're like, we'd like you to go overseas. I'm like, what? And they're like, yeah, we would like you to run an office. I'm like, who? You know, and I'm like, really? And I'm like, well, give me a year to live in my house and then I'll reconsider it, you know. And a year later they came and said, we really want you to do it, and here's your 2 choices, Bahrain or Singapore. And I'm like, Singapore? Yeah, that sounds good. So they saw something in me that I didn't see at the time. And so in 1994, I went over, and I was the first female manager for the FAA office in Asia, all 40 countries, and I managed the security for all the U.S. carriers and the crews overseas, and also did airport safety, and responded to accidents overseas that involved U.S. fatalities or injuries. So it was a great experience, but I was kind of clueless leading up to it, and that's where great mentors and really good bosses play a key role. So sometimes I was out of school for about 8 years before I arrived at the FAA. I had done some other jobs with the White House and Justice Department, and I just couldn't find my niche. And so I think the jobs I took in those 8 years all provided me different skills that eventually led me to the perfect job with FAA in 1988. So, I mean, sometimes you kind of rush because you want it right away, but it's kind of good to have to kind of work at it for a while and to develop some of your other skill sets, like empathy and teamwork and problem solving and conflict resolution. Those are such key skills you need when you go overseas and you can't figure out where dry cleaning is, you know? So, but that's how I ended up internationally.
Great. Penny, you want to share your story?
I guess mine is slightly different because, first of all, I was born in India, and then we moved to Canada when I was 7. So I think I've had a wandering feet for since I was born. And I had always wanted to be somewhere else. I read voraciously when I was young. Therefore, my sister would be the one in the kitchen with my mom learning how to cook, and I would be reading books. So I'm a great Trivial Pursuit player, but can't cook. But I did kind of the same thing as Mary. I wanted an international career because I'd read about these places. So I'm a lawyer. So I went to law school and became a lawyer in Canada. And I practiced in Canada, Vancouver, for about 5 years. And then I thought, I think at this point I've got enough skill as a lawyer. I've learned enough that I need to take it one step forward. And I actually came here to Washington. I did a master's degree here at Georgetown. So this is we are very lucky to be here in Washington because you have exposure to so many international organizations here. I've now joined the IFC, which is actually part of the World Bank Group. So that's a very different experience for me. But I've been so impressed by my colleagues. I mean, you get into the elevator and people are talking in different languages and they're from all different countries and it's fantastic. So I got some of that vicariously when I was working here because I stayed. I was going to come just for 1 year to do my master's degree, and I kind of thought, well, actually, I should take advantage of being in a place like Washington. So I got a job with the law firm here and met people who worked at the IFC, worked at the World Bank. And after about 4 years, I thought, okay, I really want to go to Asia. So I moved to Asia with no job. So that's kind of a different thing. It wasn't, I'm not completely, I'm risk averse. People don't believe that. But my aunt and uncle lived in Hong Kong, so I knew I had a place to stay, and my mother wouldn't worry. So I went to Hong Kong. And you know what? I got my first job in Singapore. I answered an ad in the South China Morning Post. So I think so for me, it was just getting out there and going there to look at what the opportunities were. So that's how I ended up with my first real overseas assignment.
Great. And Perry, do you want to add? Because I know yours.
Well, I think mine was both planned and then totally unexpected. I mean, basically, I decided to live overseas when I went on a school trip when I was like 13. And it was a trip to Europe. And, to be completely frank, at 13 from, a family that really believed in, cotillion, et cetera, outside of Philadelphia, I went over there and I came back thinking Princess Perry was the way to go. Now, you got to remember, Prince Charles, he was still single back then. I didn't know anything about anything. I was 13, but I decided I liked the culture, I liked the architecture, whatever. I'm going to London. So it took me a bit longer than that, but after I got out of school, I worked for 2 years in a local firm and then in an agency, a communications agency, and I basically wrote a letter at the end of that 2 years, knowing that I could never get overseas with a local firm. So I wrote to every major agency in the United States that had an international network. And the deal I offered them was, I will work in any market of your choice. I'm 25, I'm not stupid. I know you have no reason to send me overseas at this point, but I will work in any US market you choose for 2 years. And you can measure my profitability and my new business turns and all this kind of stuff, the stuff that you care about. And if I do a really, really good job, then you owe me an international placement at the end of those 2 years. Are you willing to take that deal? And lucky for me, one guy was smart enough or dumb enough, whatever, to take that deal. So I moved to the Baltimore, Washington market about 25 years ago. And so I did my 2 years, and every quarter I wrote to, his name was Charles Jones, I wrote to Charles Jones, and I told him how I was doing, how was my client satisfaction, marketing. I'm basically keeping him on track, holding his feet to the fire, you promised me, international, whatever. So the wall came down, I'm that old, the wall came down in Germany, and they said, what do you think about consumer marketing in Bonn? And I was like, okay, it's not London, but it's okay. Okay. So I started taking my German lessons, I'm, plodding along. And then I get this call out of the blue one day, and it's the president of the company, and he says, well, actually, German market's not really recovering the way we thought it was going to do, and how do you feel about Singapore? And I kind of was like, Singapore who? I mean, I for a girl who wanted to live overseas, I grew up in a very small town with a family that if it didn't, beyond the country club border, we didn't talk about it, okay? It was a very narrow perspective in my family. Love them as I do, I was just such a fish out of water. So at any rate, I had no idea about anything about Singapore except that it was very far away. It was going to be hot every day, so I was going to have a bad hair day every day that I was there. And as a 25-year-old, I was worried I might be the tallest woman in the country. So that was also a problem. So that was the extent of what I knew. So I said, no, thank you. It wasn't really thoughtful. I said, probably not for me. So I get the second call, and they said, but there's this really nice woman running the operation. We really think you ought to talk to her. And I'm like, yeah, okay. So I talked to her, yeah, she's very nice, but it's still Singapore. I'll wait for the next opportunity in Europe. So then the third call, Lord Chalfont calls. And I'm not dumb enough to know that when the Lord calls, I was like, okay. So he was the head of the whole company, and he's calling me, a peon, saying, Perry, I understand we promised you Europe, but really the Singapore thing, it's going to be good for you. And what I realized is kind of 3 strikes you're out. If you don't jump on what they offer, even if it wasn't what you expected, at a certain point, then I'm at the back of the line. And so what I realized is, okay, Perry, do you want to go overseas at all? Or are you going to wait another 3 years before they ever give you another opportunity, if they ever give you another opportunity? And being one who, my whole view of life is, I go to the edge of the cliff, I look over the cliff, and I think, what's the worst thing that's going to happen if I jump off this cliff? And as long as it is survivable, whatever that thing is. So I figured with Singapore, it's like, okay, so I'm going to go. I'm going to hate it. I'm going to fail miserably, whatever. 6 months, they're going to pack my butt back home. And what's going to happen? Okay, I'm going to have to come home with my tail between my legs, and I'm going to have to live in my parents' basement. I was like, could I survive that? And I thought, yeah, okay, I'll survive that. No problem. So I went. And so 3 weeks later, I'd gotten rid of house, car, boyfriend, everything, got on the plane, and I moved to Singapore. And so you could say it was kind of planned and kind of not. And then and moving to Russia was the same thing. I just signed on for 3.5 years more in Singapore because I didn't expect to like it, but I really did. And then right after I signed on, we won this huge piece of business in Russia. And my company called and said, well, you're kind of the only person worldwide that qualifies for these 11 things that the Russian government's asking for. So it's kind of like you're going to go. The question is, how much is it going to cost us to get you there? And how fast can you get there? So there I was on Christmas Eve, arriving in Moscow. And it was brutal, but it was fabulous. And I would say that about my entire international experience. It was fascinating, fabulous, incredibly challenging, difficult, frightening, and I would never give it up.
That's great. That's interesting. So you hear all the different ways you can do it. One person who picks up and moves without the job, adventure in her soul. Another who thinks she kind of wants it but not quite sure. And one who's got her eye on one prize and gets another but still loves it. And that's really what's so interesting about international careers is you can try to plan them as much as you want, but so much just happens. And you really have to be able to take advantage of it. And the growth is almost always there. There are a few cases where I know of a few people, women, who have imploded in certain markets, and Singapore tended to have that effect on a lot of women. But the vast majority, companies and organizations usually know what they're doing in selecting women because they're very special. Women who actually can work internationally and overseas and in these tough environments are very special and have all these fabulous additional traits. So interesting different stories there. We're going to go to another kind of career question. What has been your greatest challenge in your career? Maria?
Good question. So a little bit about my background. I actually started mostly in corporate at PricewaterhouseCoopers, and then IBM, and then Ernst & Young, and I spent most of my life doing client service work, much of it overseas, mostly in Europe. And for me, just starting out as a young professional, my very, very first assignment in client service was in Germany, and it was one of those things where I wasn't really expecting to go in that direction. I grew up as a military kid. That's how we came over here to the United States. My father, back in the day in the Philippines, you got a chance to compete to enlist in the U.S. Navy, and so he won, so to speak, and served in Vietnam for several tours. And based on that experience, we were allowed to apply for citizenship. So as a young child, we were able to come over. And as a military kid moving all over the U.S., I really swore to myself that when it became my turn to make the decisions, I would pick a really nice town and I would live there and I wouldn't move and I would sit down and eat. And when you know it, something in my DNA changed from those earlier experiences and I couldn't help it. So my very first job was in management consulting, also not planned for a whole bunch of other reasons. And my very first assignment was to go in Germany. And I hadn't developed sort of a robust skill set. I was an economics major, so nothing necessarily practical, no offense to all the other econ majors out there. And so I just had a sort of a malleable skill set. So we went abroad, and I sort of embraced it, even though it wasn't planned. And I thought to myself, this is a great opportunity to differentiate myself. There were about 200,000 of us at the time. So the opportunity to set yourself apart was something that I really, really valued. And so I thought, well, great, I'm going to pay my dues, distinguish myself in this international service, and let me see how much I can do while I'm young and I don't have any ties. Well, be careful what you ask for, because I got staffed on a project. We were doing work for a company that had just experienced a major merger. So we were doing business process and systems integration across many, many countries, and I worked on the process side. And we were rolling out these changes a country a month for, it was a 12-year plan. So it was just such rapid globalization. And it was one of those things where I didn't intend to have that specialty, but sooner or later, you become that only person out of 200,000 people who can do that particular thing on that kind of scale in this particular market. And one thing led to the other. 3 years later, I'd still only come back to the US just a couple of times. So to get back to your original question, what was the biggest challenge? Was having a life. I had moved to New York, got a ridiculous apartment in Soho. It was a 5th floor walk up. I still remember 3 of us sharing a 1-bedroom apartment, spending $2,000 each. We clearly didn't have a good sense of the market. And finding, it was very, very hard to find a subletter. I just had imagined this New York life for myself. And I just never, I didn't come home. And still to this day, many years later, I'm older than I look, still doing international work. And for about a year, I stayed at home, still about 70% travel. The ability to have a personal life has been the biggest challenge. And, you know, I'll be really honest, you make certain sacrifices a different part of your life. And I have found very few people who have this kind of life that haven't made trade-offs. You know, it still worked out. I'm in a great relationship, 5.5 months pregnant. Much to my mother's chagrin, it's happened much later in life than she would have wanted.
No, that can work.
But those were choices, and so that was the hardest thing, maintaining that balance.
Great, great. Debbie?
I think I would look at it 2 ways. I think professionally and personally, probably different challenges. Professionally, I think challenges you want to embrace, it's very hard. For instance, just like you've heard from all the other panelists, this is what I usually say. I was born in Taiwan, and I grew up in Canada. Then I lived in Chile for 2.5 years, and I've been in the US for 11 years. And during the time I've been in the US, I've had many other opportunities to move within the US, as well as do other international travels, whether it's short duration or other requests for me to move again, relocate to other international countries. But I looked at it as, you know, God chose Taiwan, my parents chose Canada, my husband chose Chile, and I chose the US. So I will have to say, you know, when you think about it, when I went to Chile, you know, we heard stories of not having a job for adventures or maybe Prince Charles. Well, I went for love.
So glad that didn't work out, by the way. Really,
So
really
lucky.
glad about that.
But, you know, so people were like, Debbie, going to Chile. Like, they really would have thought, well, you're going to London, you're going to Paris. I went to Santiago, Chile, wonderful country, but certainly not something I might have, you know, instantly been associated with me. I went for love. I spoke no Spanish. The second language in Canada is French. I remember I couldn't even say hola. You got into a taxi and I couldn't even, I mean, you didn't know what to say. And actually, I went in 1998, the very first taxi I got into, and when they realized I was from Canada, but, you know, North America, they say, Monica Lewinsky. Seriously.
Those were the good years.
So I think professionally, certainly the language challenge, absolutely, if you live there, it's by osmosis. You really can pick it up, and it's a wonderful asset to have. But it's absolutely a challenge. You want to smile, you want to be polite, but you know what? For the first 3 months, half of the time, you have no idea what they're saying, right? Another thing I think is challenges. I went to Chile. We just talked about if you pick some of the larger, more developed, safer countries, I certainly think you get a wonderful experience. But if you go to a maybe emerging, less developed, or smaller countries, what you get to do is you get a lot more responsibilities than you would get if you go to an established organization and country. So from that perspective, I definitely think professionally, I had a lot of technical challenges, language challenges, but those were good challenges to have. I think personal challenge, you know, Maria, you talked about having a life. Certainly, you do have to make personal life sacrifices. I think anytime you relocate, that's something I think you should be prepared and be open to, and know that, you know, with sacrifice comes rewards. But I will also have to say, you know, at first, I would say the first week, you know, in the Latin culture, people are much more, I think, just warm-blooded, shall I say it politically correctly. So then, the first week, people will give you compliments even when you're just walking down the street and you think, oh, wow, they think you're attractive. Exactly, piropos. And then after that, whether it's at work, whether it's, just literally shopping, walking down the street, they really do think they're paying you a compliment. But in our culture, that's not what we think. We get somewhat bothered by it. We think that's annoying, and we think that's invading your personal space, and we think it's inappropriate. So that was another thing that, from a personal perspective, I absolutely had that challenge, had to adjust to it and live with it. But then knowing that, if you didn't live there, if you weren't exposed to it, and now you have to deal with it in a business transaction or in a business environment, you wouldn't appreciate it, and you may react differently, and that might screw up the business transaction because they were meaning in a totally different way. So even though it was a challenge, I think I absolutely learned something from that.
That's great. Yeah. So clearly, all kinds of challenges that you can't even begin to anticipate. So you have to be prepared for anything. It sounds like great, personally and professionally. That's a good segue into. Can you provide an example of when you felt being a woman had a positive impact in an international situation? Tammy, you want to take that?
Sure. First of all, I ended up in Korea. My mother was working for the U.S. government, so I had a free place to live while I job hopped, or while I was searching for a job. But I first went to the American Chamber of Commerce in Korea, met the senior person there, and asked advice. And he said, well, you can either be a secretary or you could teach English, neither of which I'm qualified or really interested in. So it was kind of ironic that 7 years later I replaced him.
Took 7 years, huh?
Yeah, really. But I sort of stumbled into a position with AIG. At that time, they were a good company. Yeah. And the market, again, I really didn't know what I didn't know. My father was in the military. We moved every year or so. I'd never been to Asia, but I saw MASH. Come on, I landed at the airport, expected Trapper John to be there, and he wasn't. But I was absolutely astounded at the Korean economy and how well it was doing. So just started, I went to the American Chamber office, bought their membership directory, and just started calling companies. And people said, this is never going to work until I started in the A's. AIG, literally one of the first companies I called said, you like Korea, you want to stay here, please. Can you sign this here? So I thought I would stay 1 or 2 years, get a little experience on my resume, and then come home. And again, I'd never lived anywhere longer than a year. I left Korea after 21 years only because I have elderly parents. And frankly, at the American Chamber of Commerce, I had so capped out their salary, and they had they'd changed the title. You're now president. Now you're president and CEO. They said, how do you feel about Queen? I said, well, I feel pretty good about it. But, my parents, I really do need to get home. So I came back to America. And I'm sorry, I forgot, what's your question?
You're being very entertaining, which is very important. An example of when you felt the importance of being a woman really made a difference.
My segue is that I have a sense of humor, and I found a sense of humor all over the world, but particularly in Asia. Korea in the late 80s was very much a male-dominated society, and it pretty much still is today. I was very often the only woman in the room, unless there was somebody coming in to serve tea, or if you were at one of those particular restaurants where the very attractive, often Ivy League educated women would feed the men in the room. It was a pretty odd situation, but I found that the biggest challenge I had was always with, how do I say this politically correct, Caucasian American men of a certain age. The Korean men and the Korean women, they didn't know how to take me. They found as long as you're competent and you seem to respect us and you're pretty funny, they would deal with me. But the American men of a certain age, they were the ones that I had the biggest challenge with. And ironically, they also became my biggest supporters in the end. But initially, when I applied for the AmCham position, they said, Korean men won't deal with you. So I said, okay, that's an interesting perspective, and I set about getting a couple of Korean ministers, a couple of members of the National Assembly again, if you're nice to people and you are respectful and you realize that culture, and again, when we're going global, we're going international, everybody's culture is different. It's not a right or wrong. Whether they drive on the other side of the road, but if you treat it respectfully and you seem to really like the culture, people will be very forgiving. I think being an American woman in Asia is a huge asset. There are oftentimes, my male counterparts would tell me, we have this particular problem and we think you need to go in and you'll be the best one to help us resolve it. Perhaps it's being more empathetic, maybe it's a higher emotional IQ, or just being creative in how you solve it. But I found being a woman in Asia, first of all, I meet men in Korea now who are like, I'm Mr. Kim. We met 20 years ago. Do you remember me? I'm like, yes, Mr. Kim. You look like 50 million people out there. I remember exactly. I always say, you look really familiar. Can you give me some background? But I don't have a clue who they are. They all will remember that one chubby, funny white girl they met 20 years ago. Okay, it's helpful that, one of them became the prime minister. Another one happens to be the president now. These aren't bad things, but a lot of it is just because I was willing. I didn't know what I didn't know, and I was willing to try anything, and I wasn't afraid of making a fool of myself. If you'll permit me, one funny story. I'm at a Korean lunch with the labor minister. We're talking about some very challenging things. Unionization was a big issue in Korea. Democracy had just been declared, so lots of strikes. And we're sitting on the floor, no problem. I'm adaptable. I can sit on the floor. After a 2.5-hour lunch, when you stand up, what happened to you happened to me. I fell through a paper, they had screens. I fell onto another table's dining thing, and I recovered. I stood up and said, well, you will all remember me. I did not give my correct name, but it doesn't really matter. That woman was mean to me. She shouldn't have been mean to me, so I gave her name. But so there are ways to do it. But have a sense of humor, be willing to try new things, and you don't know what you don't know. You can do anything.
That's great. Mary, I know you were in Asia, but you also were in a man's industry of aviation. Do you have any examples of that?
Much like in the FAA, when you go overseas, and regardless if you're in Bahrain, Jordan, or Mongolia, they really could care less if you're black or white, a male or female. Can you answer the questions? Can you help us with our aviation safety or air traffic control? And through that process, you figure out quite early on that they just want competencies. And again, your humor does really help. I was in Asia, and I was in a bar, Irish, there you go. And anyways, and I saw one of the security managers for one of the large airlines, and he came over to me and he said, Mary, are you going to grease my body? And I'm like, what? My friends are all looking at me like, who's this guy? And he has a big smile on his face. He's like, Mary, are you going to grease my body? I'm like, what is this guy saying to me? And I know he's not saying that. And what he was saying is, Mary, are you going to the Christmas party? Because of the heavy accent, but if I had gotten like, he's the head of security for a big airline. He's now a CEO of a very large airline. If I got all offended and say, I don't want you to grease my body, so you have to be kind of careful, You'll hear things that you're not really sure of and stuff. I grew up like Penny. My parents are immigrants, and I read, you will go to school, and this is a good country. And I read a lot of Nancy Drew, and I thought, I would love to be Nancy Drew. She has friends and a convertible and a boyfriend named Ned, and I'm going to do this. And then I went to criminal justice. I went to Northeastern. I was a criminal justice major, and I really liked it. And I kind of fell into the explosives and dangerous good, hazardous material kind of area. But it was always male dominated, and it can be, there'll be 52 men and you. And they all want to know who the woman is in the room, and they do believe that, she must be really good, or she applied for the job, one of those things. And, they just, not sure. But, I was the first manager for Asia for security. I was in the first ones that went into Mongolia, into the Russian Far East, and they had never met a woman in my position before. So usually we would do a series of air carrier station inspections and airport security inspections, and at the end we'd have a big lunch, and there'd be an exchange of gifts, government to government. And this one country gave me a gift, and they said, here's your gift, and like, we're so sorry, we don't have a lady gift for you. And I said, oh, okay. So I opened it up, and it was a lovely tie. And I said, oh, thank you very much. And they're like, but when you come back, we're going to go shopping, and we're going to get you a lady gift. I said, okay. So, 6 months later, I had to go back, and there was 3 elderly Asian men, and they're like, we went shopping specifically for you, and we have got you a lady gift. I'm like, oh, brother, what is this going to be, So, at the end of the 2 weeks, we do the air carrier station inspections and the security inspections, and we have our luncheon, and they're like, please open the gift. And I'm like, oh. So anyways, I opened it up, and they're so excited, and they had bought me an apron. So I was like, oh. And I'm like, it kind of reminded me of like when my dad would be coming home, and he'd forget it was my mother's birthday, and he'd go to the gas station and buy gas station flowers for her, And I'm like, but they really put a lot of thought and effort into finding me a lady gift and getting me an apron. And it's still my favorite apron. It's my only apron, but it's my favorite apron, So you can't get all, they had the best, intentions of making me feel comfortable and making me feel welcome. They were very embarrassed that they gave me a tie. I thought it was kind of cute, But, so those are the kinds of things you kind of have to walk into with a little bit of sense of humor and a little bit of openness,
So that's good for the next question, which is a sense of humor as well as openness. But now for our audience, which all look pretty young, so as they're moving out into the world, and what kind of advice would you give them as to how to prepare to work in a country or to go on a business trip, that first one? How do you prepare, cross-cultural awareness, those kinds of things, especially in countries that are very different from the United States? And so many more, especially with markets opening up in the Middle East, and there are all kinds of ideas floating around, whether they're real or imagined or somewhere in between, about male-dominated cultures, that still do exist. And so what kind of advice would you give on kind of how to prepare for that? Because clearly you're seasoned, you're funny. Clearly we could have a little bit of a comedy routine here, I think. People might actually pay. But that's kind of a retrospective too as you look back. But what kind of advice? How should young women prepare? Let's see. How about Perry? Answer that.
Sure. So I think one of the things, when you go to a male-dominated market, the first thing to do is do your homework, okay? Figure out, what does male-dominated mean, and then you have to figure out, okay, how are they going to treat you as if it's an Asian market. So my first trip to Korea, it was South Korea. It was, I definitely saw that, the men were waiting to see whether I would pour the tea or whatever. And I just sat there, I was, again, 50 men, and me. And I'm just sitting there, and they're all waiting, figuring eventually she's going to cave. She's going to pour the drinks, and and then that would be a loss of face for me because I had given in and whatever else. And I read the book on the plane. I knew you're not pouring the tea, okay? There's a certain level, I had to be taken as
seriously.
Yeah, exactly, seriously, as a businesswoman. So I just waited. I waited 40 minutes. I'm not really good at being quiet or still for 40 minutes, I can assure you. And I sat there a full 40 minutes looking at my watch, waiting. And finally they just figured, okay, she ain't going to do it. So they went ahead, and there's a button under the desk. They pushed the button, and in walked the secretary. Exactly. She poured tea for everybody, and then we had the meeting.
But that was huge because that set the tone for your whole
Correct.
relationship.
I passed the test.
Yes.
But I wouldn't have known that if I hadn't done my homework before I went. So that's the first thing I would say is do your homework. The second thing is, what I think is great about women, and yeah, okay, I'm biased, I totally admit that, but I think it's great that women are very pragmatic. So when I first went to Asia, I was a 25-year-old, 5'9", redhead with blue eyes, and my hair was like down to here and all these curls, and, actually was a size 8, so I was looking okay. And nobody in China had ever seen anything like me. It was, and they actually have a story in China. I don't know whether you guys know this story, but we talk about the boogeyman for our kids. Well, the boogeyman for China is essentially me. It is a big white woman with red hair and blue eyes, right? And so, kids just screaming in terror as I'm backpacking my way through China in 1991. But anyway, I digress for a second. But the point is that what I had to figure out was that when you have to decide what is it that really matters and keep your eye on the prize. So the fact that people would stand in the elevator and boing, my hair, call it boing, they'd pull a curl, which they used to be really long, they would pull a curl, but I was like, something, I'm just going to ignore that, right? I'm not going to get up in their face about it. I'm just going to let that go. But conversely, when you're in a negotiation, the fact that I was 25 and not too bad to look at, and I could then turn this thing about Asian face, right? If I had to correct the client and tell them they were wrong, okay, this is a loss of face. But if you're a girl and you're a young girl and you can turn it around and you can make it seem like their idea, okay, then they're buying your advice. So the win, keep your eye on the prize. That's the lesson. Keep your eye on the prize. They're buying your advice. That's a win for your consulting business, and they're also doing the right thing by taking your advice, because the advice I was usually giving in Asia was how to work in the United States. That's what I mean. I didn't know Asia like they knew Asia, but I was being paid to give advice in the US. So I think women are great at that, and so just forget the small stuff, ignore it, don't worry about it, keep your eye on the prize, and don't feel that they've degraded you because they think you're a young woman. My view is set your strategy for how you're going to use that to your advantage. And I'll tell you one example from a friend of mine who I met in Russia later on. So in Russia, it was kind of the same thing, right? Everybody was looking. I was 28 by then, but I was still a young American female. And so my girlfriend was the head of Business Week there. And she actually used to get to go to these very important Russian government meetings. And the thing is, even as a reporter, they totally ignored she was even in the room. So she got 8 cover stories in just a few years in Russia. Why? Because she used being a woman of being inconsequential because she was a girl. So they left her in the room while they were having these conversations. She speaks fluent Russian. They left her in the room having these conversations, senior government ministers, because she kind of faded into the background because she was just a girl. And so I say, don't be upset about being just a girl, okay? You got to prepare yourself. That's not what matters. What mattered is she got 8 cover stories. She was a hot reporter for Business Week. I got the contracts, and then I delivered on them. That's what mattered. And over time, the men actually began to realize you weren't just nice to have at the meeting. You actually were substantive. And because you didn't go like this and fight them head on and create a loss of face, a lot of people struggle with that because I want them to know I had the right idea. And I said, I want my company to know I sold the contracts because that was how my career was going to advance. So, focus on what matters. Keep your eye on the prize. Be pragmatic. And just be willing to accept the little things, but never let anyone degrade you or cross that line. I absolutely, positively, no one was allowed to touch parts of me, and they will try. No one was allowed, there were no offers that I was going to accept for, after hours activities. Forget it. And I made that really clear. And that I think you also have to do.
Yeah. There was a lot of people who would say, I am a geographical bachelor. I
love that one. I heard that one, yes.
When I am on travel, I am a bachelor. I'm like, oh, brother. You know what I mean?
That's right. Go bachelor somewhere else. Thank you. Right.
But they might be, a general, or, you'd have to get out of it gracefully.
Or they would say, I'm single. And I say, oh, but is your wife? Oh, no, she's married. Okay, well, then let's go chat with her.
I also think if you can find a mentor, just to run stuff by, it's very helpful. And it could be a man or woman, and it can be someone who you might be interested in the Middle East, and they might have been based in Europe, but there's a lot of similarities, even though the territory is different, and they can provide some really good advice and some insight.
And I also think everything Mary and Perry said, I absolutely agree. But just, the humorous examples that you illustrated. On the other hand, as a young woman going internationally, you absolutely have to know your self-worth. But I believe there's a difference between being aggressive and being assertive.
Right.
And I think sometimes because we may be younger, we're a woman, we're in an unfamiliar situation, we tend to think we need to make up for it, so you overcompensate. And you come across as aggressive. And I think when you do that, that tends to have a defensive note to it, and people don't react well to it. So I think it's important to try to understand for every single one of us, what will come across as aggressive and what is assertive. Because to me, assertive means you know your worth, you know what you can bring to the table, you've done your homework, you're prepared, and you're not scared to speak up for it because you have a good idea. So I think that's also very important to make sure you know where that line is. and that'll help you to come across more polished and professional as well.
Great. That's great. Great advice. Okay, so now we've just talked about working with men cross-culturally, but there is a lot going on with female entrepreneurs around the world, and there's a lot of economic development. So the next question is, what role do you see women around the world playing in economic development? Maria?
Well, a little bit more about my background. I work for Vital Voices, which is an international NGO based here in DC. We were founded by then First Lady Hillary Clinton and then Secretary of State Madeleine Albright to sort of catalyze women's empowerment in 3 areas, which is political participation, human rights, mostly violence against women, and economic development with a strong focus on entrepreneurship. And so leveraging the background that I had in corporate and mostly business advisory, business consulting, I was so excited to take this role. And actually, I'm in the position now, and it is my first NGO role. So for those of you who are thinking about careers in economic development, I can attest. It is a very different world from corporate. I can't say that enough, but it's such a great learning experience. And one of the things that I'm most grateful for is the opportunity to work with women entrepreneurs around the world. One of the things that we see in a lot of our developing and emerging markets is that most women have to go into entrepreneurship by necessity, not by choice, not for opportunity, because there aren't other viable forms of employment that are easy to get. And in general, women's workforce participation is low. We're doing a major program in Mexico in the next few months with the Business Women's Network, and even there, Mexico, one of the most rapidly growing economies in the world, women's labor force participation, formal or informal, is only about 46% relative to men's at roughly 84%. So, for women, entrepreneurship can be the only thing that they have to do, but it can also be a great opportunity. Women bring such a unique, broad perspective to business, and particularly from the perspective of the consumer. We make most of the consumer purchasing decisions, but also as producers, and I think that is largely understated. The Global Entrepreneurship Monitor did a recent report looking at women's entrepreneurship around the world and found that in the last couple of years, there are about 104 million women who have started a business, in addition to about 83 million women who had started business in the 3.5 years prior. So over that 4 to 5 year span, that's 187 million women who are currently in entrepreneurship, and yet they are underrepresented in sort of the medium and large enterprise space and overrepresented in micro to small. So for us, I think we see a great opportunity in economic development for women's voices to be heard. Why are we most of the businesses when you look at the number, but very few of the market leaders in the world, very few of the businesses that really hold the wealth and the productive power. So in economic development, there is too much work, I think, to be done. You look at some of the great organizations, AID, TechnoServe Care, there are a lot of women doing the work. There's still an opportunity for women to rise to levels of leadership, levels of management, so they're really making some of the decisions about how these economic development programs are created. I'll just give one quick example. We're working on a major partnership for the upcoming Clinton Global Initiative, and one of our partners who does a lot of the work in the field was lamenting with us about a recent program they did in Ethiopia, was designed for women entrepreneurs, but all the people on the design team were men, all the implementation people are men. And one of the things that they saw within the first year is that the dropout rate of participating entrepreneurs was double that within women than it was for men, and they couldn't figure it out. Well, then my colleague who works on the team, who came on later, quickly could see it was on a Sunday. Most of the family work happened there. It was situated far from where the women lived, so they would have had to be away from their families for 8 to 10 hours at a time, and it just wasn't conducive to the way they lived their life. And any woman could have seen that. And I think that's the kind of perspective that women can bring to economic development, from the place of being able to make the decisions where we still have a huge gap.
That's great. Great. Okay, I'm going to move on to another question, then we're 2 more quick questions, and then we're going to open it up to the floor. What did you have to learn the hard way and wish someone had offered you practical advice on? Penny?
I think it goes back to some of the things that people have already spoken about here, and it is that you don't always have to be right, and knowing the answer actually isn't always the right thing to bring forward when you're in a particular situation. It goes, and I have had most of my career in the financial services industry, so it's completely dominated by men. And so if you come across as, as being too strident, then you get the whole, she's just, she's going through a difficult period, kind of thing. So you could be the smartest person in the room, but you have to learn when to show it and figure out. Sometimes, you go down a certain path. It's not going to work because you're going to be met with whatever the barriers are. Whether it's because you're a woman, you're foreign, you speak a different accent, and sometimes I had to learn to back off and figure out when was the right time to come back, or maybe a different approach. So you do need to know the answers. So the advice about being prepared and having done your homework is absolutely right. Because if you ever find yourself in a situation that people can pretty much suss out whether you are bullshitting them or not. And if you are, you've lost your credibility. So do your homework, but also being right isn't always going to get you through to being the most effective that you can be. And as Perry said, don't lose sight of what your goal is. Whatever your goal is, whether it's to sell that, sign the contract, or in my case, get a license from a regulator, or get a certain kind of, deal okayed or whatever, that's what you need to have, accomplished, not to be acknowledged as the person who was right.
Great, that's great. What are the pros and cons of an international career and/or your biggest reward? Tammy?
I think the obvious pro is, you get to live in different cultures. You get to meet people from all over the world. Traveling around Asia for the last 25 years, it's amazing. The cons, I would have to agree with the person who said sometimes you have to make some sacrifices in your personal life. Sometimes you have to miss certain events. One of my nieces reminded me last weekend that I didn't attend any of my nieces or nephews' high school or college graduation. So she's getting her master's, and she expects me to make up for everything in a couple weeks. And I'm happy to do that. That's what American Express is for. But the opportunity to be able to also to make a difference. To me, one essential difference that I see from many women working in Asia is women are more flexible. We're not always so ego-driven. So many of the comments these friends have made really resonate with me. Being around a board table, and you will often see men they have to get credit, and if they don't get credit, we're going to have blood on the table. And all too often people forget what is our main objective. And again, I don't care whose name on it. I want to make sure the program goes well. If that goes well, people will know. They'll always know who did the heavy lifting and the hard work. But it's an incredible life. For any of you who have a serious interest in going abroad, you really pursue it at all costs. Also, I would encourage you, learn the language. It's not always easy. Asian languages are really, really hard. And as I had several of my Korean teachers tell me, because I've been fired as a student. I've actually, my last Korean professor said, "Don't tell anyone I was your professor." and you should take golf lessons, because you will never speak my language. You give me a headache, and golf will help you so much more. So I'm proud to say I am much better at golf than I am at Korean. But just the fact that I tried, and I can say a few things really, really well. But that's it. But making that effort, just being able to say, please, thank you, how much is this, where's the restroom? Those are, I could say them in about 11 languages. So, I'm pretty gold. So.
That's actually a really good point, I think. And if many of you are still studying, you still have an opportunity to study and do the best you can to actually study as much as you can. Once you leave campus, don't necessarily switch to another language unless you're moving to the country, but try to keep it up. And for any of you interested in foreign language, we have I'm just going to stand on a soapbox for a minute. We have a real problem, I think, in our country where we send kids to college and universities who are not prepared to learn a second language. And it's really important that people learn earlier and earlier. So as you go out and you have wonderful careers and you have kids, or you see your nieces and nephews or cousins, encourage them and encourage their parents and as parents to learn a foreign language as early as possible. because it really will make a difference in your career long term. I just spoke with a person, actually two short stories on the language, which is one I spoke to a headhunter who said, oh, well, you know, this person actually got the job in this, you know, we were talking about different positions. This person actually got the job because they actually were bilingual in English and Spanish. They had 7 years less experience than the other candidate who was preferred from a skill level, but because the person had, maybe not bilingual, but proficient enough to make it work, they got the job. That's a really big difference. We haven't seen a lot of that, but that's going to happen more and more, so it's really important. The other one is, I think from a foreign language perspective, do it as much as you can. It's also fun. You know, I have tried to learn. I was taking Mandarin lessons in Hong Kong, then I was taking Cantonese lessons. My kids try to get me to take Spanish lessons, and it's on my list of things to do before I kick the bucket, is actually to do something. And my kids actually go to language immersion in the summer. I'm one of those moms, Chinese language camps, and they've taken Spanish language. So do that as much as possible. You're the future, and it really, really matters, because another company that I talked to said that they were looking for 12 students who actually spoke. It's a big company that's expanding in Asia. They were looking for 12 graduates who actually were fluent in English and Mandarin. The only students they could find were Chinese nationals. No American student could fill. That was frightening to me, and I actually got goosebumps again. It really, really is at a critical mass, and I think we really need to pay attention to it. So.
And Stacie, if I could just add on to your first story, that literally just happened to me recently in the last few months. I think in my bio you might have seen I've been on the World Bank as an audit partner. I recently rolled off that. One of the reasons is because my firm asked me to be the lead audit partner when we were proposing for the Inter-American Development Bank, which is like a regional World Bank group organization. They asked me to be the lead partner. We have two other partners supporting me, both male. One is 5 years older than me with 5 more years of experience. The other one has 7 more years of experience than me, but I'm the lead partner. And I'm very happy, of course, to say that we won IDB as a client. But the fact that I've lived in South America, I speak the language, and hopefully with the rest of my skill sets, but absolutely international experience and language. I would like to think that set me apart, and that certainly, I think, accelerates my career in ways that someone else who may not have that experience or the language skill set, they just couldn't do it. So absolutely, it happens.
Great. Yeah, so take it seriously. Okay, so we're going to open up the floor to questions. Hopefully you've had lots of fodder to think about. And ask, you've gotten to know our panelists, you can ask personal and professional questions, I'm confident. They will answer them all.
That's right.
You might have to turn off the tape. Just kidding.
Oh yeah, the tape. Forgot about that. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, we're being taped.
Yeah? You want to use the mic? Or
I release one back.
I'm just interested, I think the panel here is unbelievable. I'm here as a guest. My wife is from Argentina. She went to Mount Vernon College for women in the 1970s. I was one of the first U.S. citizens working as a young professional at the Inter-American Development Bank. Because I couldn't speak Spanish, they put me in the English-speaking Caribbean, so I was on project missions going to Barbados, Jamaica, the Bahamas, Trinidad, and then it was a male-dominated experience for me. You know, the women were doing secondary positions. This is in the early '80s, and then I was called to go to Citibank to help William Rhodes in the workouts in New York, and I noticed that there I got introduced to the women, The women, that was the time in the mid-'80s when the glass ceiling was extremely important. And so I actually heard people say in the room, when I was the only male in the room, in boardrooms, they were all women, and they were saying, well, we can't promote the man because that's not going to help us. And so you know, the women were VPs, SVPs, and they said, the only way we're going to get past the glass ceiling is to keep the men down and push all of the women forward. So that, I just want to make that observation to show that the opposite can be true sometimes here in the U.S., especially in the financial sector. Then I went to work in the oil business. The opposite was true. I was in Texas, and they would do things that I can't really repeat here. But then I promised my wife 3 months in her country This is 1988, and I gave up a master's degree in Johns Hopkins Science here to go down to Argentina for 3 months, and I stayed 22 years because Exxon gave me an offer I couldn't refuse. And there, the whole South American experience, starting with Argentina, was very machistic. Very, you were talking about the piropios, but I also think that, I see a lot of my male friends were getting the opposite from the women. So the women were also very aggressive in the street as well, which was amazing to me. I never expected that. But then I saw that the women in South America and many countries advanced to very high positions politically and in the corporate sector much quicker than they did here in the U.S. And I always said, why does that happen in Latin America? Why are women elected presidents here across the board, presidents of countries, and why they're, the cabinet ministries, not just Secretary of State, but across the board, and all those things were shocking to me. And then I've been gone. I just came back to the United States, back here in Washington, and my son here is one of 5. English is a second language, and so it's a little bit of a culture shock coming back after being away for so long. But I see that for instance, Hillary Clinton almost made it, and I'm thinking the women are going forward very well, but I'm wondering, why is it that, to give you a little bit of perspective, I was in Asia last year, Singapore, spent a lot of time in Singapore, Korea, Seoul, Tokyo, Hong Kong, Macau, and I felt that I was in Latin America. I mean, I feel Asia East Asia is very Latin America. It's similar customs, similar trust issues, family, how you advance. The work ethic might not be the same, but I think that, how you establish trust, how you develop business, how you move forward is very similar to Latin America. So I think worldwide there are a lot of similarities. The United States has a great deal of catching up to do. So the culture shock that we're going through coming back now, my children are experiencing it, both in college and out, and they're saying that they were shocked at how far behind the U.S. is, not just in foreign language, but in cultural sensibilities. And if the United States doesn't get up to speed quick, they're just going to be left behind. And so I would say to the students, the graduates that are here, and that they've got to be the vanguard. They've got to move forward, because if they don't do it, the country has no future.
Yes, I would absolutely agree. Thank you for that global international perspective. And you said something that I want to embellish on a bit, which is you mentioned that there are more similarities than differences. And when you've worked internationally, I think that a lot of people will say that that's true. So people really, there's no reason to really be scared, because there are so many more similarities than differences. Yeah, great. Yeah. I'm sorry. It's you, the woman in black.
Hi, good evening.
Hello.
My question and my concern with working internationally is can you talk about the work-life balance and getting your partner on board? I'm former military, and it's been very hard while in the military, and a lot of the women experience that. Because you go abroad for a great position to drag them along where they may have a job, they may not have a job, and if you have children or not, just your responsibilities as a mother or as a wife or partner.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start. I have to say, so, we asked what's the greatest challenge that you faced in your career? For me, it is absolutely combining a big global job with small children. And so my daughter, I have a 22-year-old and a just turned 8. And the just turned 8 I had when I was 39. And it was another one of those fabulous surprises. Best surprise ever, okay? But anyway, a bit of a surprise. So what I would say is, and I'm going to answer the question, so with my husband, it's interesting, what was the greatest pro for me in terms of working overseas? It was the fact that I ended up coming back to America, and my husband and I met after I had gone and worked in 56 countries around the world. I moved home, and I promptly married a foreigner. And we picked each other because he was so tired of American women who had no perspective on the world, et cetera, et cetera. And I was viewing, we were in New York at the time, and I was viewing most of the American men that I met to have absolutely no perspective on the world. And so we ended up, getting together. What I would say is that, and my experience with him was, we met in New York and in Connecticut, which are both much more, and Washington would be the same, very international, et cetera. My story, the research we did for our book would indicate that the number one reason that expat assignments fail is a family issue. They fail or they end early is a family issue. So it's either a spouse
unhappy spouse, yeah.
Right, an unhappy spouse or a child that just can't cut it if you're talking about older children in school or whatever. And so it is so critical that you see this issue and that you can get your partner on board. And so I'll tell my story, because my story, I didn't have to take him overseas. He was from overseas. He loves to live everywhere else in the world. I had to take him to Chicago, okay? It was on his list of 5 places in America he would live. I didn't think it was going to be that hard. It was brutal. He hated Chicago. 5 years that man hated Chicago, and it made my life and my job really hard. And so what I would say to you, the tips that I learned is, first of all, make them have to go with you on the trip while you are scouting out whether you're really going to go, right? It can't be just about you, because the truth is, once you get over there, it's about all of you. So you have got to get them involved. And while my husband said, yes, I can do it, right? If he'd added the thing, but I will make you miserable every day for 5 years, I probably wouldn't have taken the craft job. No matter what, I would have kind of said, I don't think it's worth it. And I think I didn't, because he said, okay, I thought he had done the thinking to decide whether he could really make a life there. And he landed, and it was clear he had already decided. He was counting from the day we got there. And so I think you really do need to take them on the journey. You need to be realistic. There was a reason I didn't get married till later in life. My dad used to say, honey, it's not that you're completely unmarriable. It's like you're never in town for a second date. And that was true. And so the minute I changed my life and actually went from an agency mindset where I was never home, traveling 3 weeks out of every month, a different country all the time, to a corporate job where it was a North American corporate job, so I was home more often. On the 3rd date I met my husband, I decided to marry him. I was done. I knew what I was looking for, and it was over. But it was really important not to just take the okay, but I should have really worked it through with him, so that all that stuff I said about the research I did, about the culture, about the climate, about everything, the geography, he's an open ocean yacht racer. No open oceans out in Chicago.
Lake.
We knew this, right? I thought Lake Michigan pretty darn big. I thought he could survive. No, apparently not. So you're absolutely right to be worried about that. And I think the only thing is to try and involve him early on and narrow down where would he be comfortable? Where could he go? And then you may have to direct your search there if that's really important, because an unhappy family is not worth it. It's just not worth it if you really want to stay a family. And I would say my greatest joy is that I found my husband and we have 2 fabulous kids, and I would never give that up. But it makes it harder or it makes it great, depending.
Right. Another thing I would say is, because I did relocate with my husband, he picked Chile, so I got to pick the next place.
Yes,
so
we had the same deal. That's why I'm in Annapolis, Maryland now.
It's equitable and it actually works. I will have to say, be very honest, since we've all been very honest. Chile was a wonderful, wonderful career experience for me. Personal experience-wise, it was very tough. I would say the first 6 months that I was in Chile was the toughest 6 months of my life. It was tough. I got better, and I think the couple with their son over there is going to appreciate this. At the end, we were supposed to go for 1.5 years. Firm asked us to extend, so we extended to 2 years. Asked us to extend again, 2.5 years. My firm knew I was adamant I was coming back. His firm still didn't give up hope. They knew how much I loved Buenos Aires. They offered to fly me to Buenos Aires every month if he could stay. So anyways, yes, everything. But
what is
anyway,
not to love in Buenos Aires? Sorry.
Absolutely. Paris of South America.
He
Yes.
stayed longer.
Let's go back to reality.
But anyway,
For 10 years.
We don't want to talk.
no, but I think honestly, he picked first, and I agreed to it, and it was a challenge, but you know what, you get through that. You certainly, of course, personal dynamics, and you need to make sacrifices, and you need to make decisions. So I got to pick the next place, and I picked San Francisco. So I do think if you also kind of right up front, make sure he or you feel like it's not a one-way street, especially because, you know, I agree with Perry to the extent that you could focus your search on different geographies, that's great. But sometimes, for instance, you know, in many of our cases, our jobs or our career ask us to go to one specific place. So you may not have the luxury of choosing which geography to go. In which case, if you kind of try to let him know that, well, if you come and you can stand it, of course, you both have to buy into it, you get to pick that next place. That might help a little bit as well. And that worked for me, so.
And that actually, I'll completely support that strategy. That's how I got through the last 3 years. I told him, you pick the next place. 5 years, you pick the next place. I'll move anywhere in the world you want to go. He picked Annapolis, Maryland. It took me we bought a house that month in Annapolis, Maryland. We promptly rented it out for 3 years because I said, I'm serious, but you're not moving yet. You got to stay 3 more years. He perked up, definitely got better. And then 5 years to the day when I transferred him to Chicago, Kraft then agreed to transfer me to Annapolis, Maryland. So, you know, you can do it. You just have to work hard at it.
And I'll add, my husband actually left his job in D.C. He worked for the World Resource Institute and just followed me. And completely left the family, everything here in D.C. for 3 years in Hong Kong. But our conversation started really early on when we started dating. I said, you know, our first trip was trekking in Nepal together. So I kind of got a sense of, and that was after we'd known each other about 6 months, that he actually also had a global mindset. He had worked in Sweden. He actually spoke French. So actually there was that bent there. I would not, I don't think, so if anyone's partnerless right now, if you're really seriously thinking about it, make sure that you begin to have those conversations early on, because you really don't want to fall in love with somebody who's, I met 3 people last week in Boston. They're married to dentists. They're like, what do I do? I'm like, I don't know. You know, a dentist, you know, Smiles Without Borders. I mean, create something. But, you know, you really have to think about that, because an unhappy spouse or a partner is no fun. Also, you know, there are alternatives too. You know, we've all talked about, you know, a couple of our husbands, but you know, there are gay relationships that may or may not work in other parts of the world. So you really have to think about that, but really make sure that you're both in there, because it can make a huge difference, and you can have a great time. We came back after 3 years. They wanted me to keep moving on, but he wanted to return, so we did. But I made him promise, again, because everything is about compromise, that we would continue to travel internationally, and so we have. So, another question.
Hi, my name is Michelle Dorsey, and I'd like to thank all of the panelists and the moderator for taking the time to share your experiences with us. I'm part of the GW World Executive MBA program. We'll be graduating in December. And we just completed a consulting practicum in Ghana. We're going to Turkey in May. What can you share with me in terms of my resume and the search for international career? What kind of first steps and what tips can you offer that I can start now so I can be better positioned?
I'll take that. Yeah. I'm the only federal government person up here. Federal government's a great place to start. We have embassies in 188 countries. We also support the UN, NATO, all the various different international organizations. And we have everything from entry-level jobs until executive jobs. You go into the government, you're really not going to be rich, but you'll have a nice lifestyle, but they train you, they invest in you. You can have many, many different experiences and jobs within one organization. I get bored every 3.5 years and have to do something different, but I stay within FAA, and I can hone different skills within the organization. So I would look at the federal government right now. It's an election year. All the law enforcement agencies are hiring. Customs and Border Patrol, Secret Service, FBI, CIA, NSA, it's all online. The process is long. It can take 8 months. You have to go through lie detector tests and all kinds of different things. But once you get to the job offer, they invest in you. And they really don't care if you're male or female. Can you do the job? And every embassy in the world has these positions. Treasury Department just opened up attachés overseas. embassies are growing, both with law enforcement, non-law enforcement organizations. So I would take a look at what is out there in the federal arena, in the intelligence area. The United States government, we don't have, again, the high salaries, but we have some of the best toys in the world. We would have an airplane go down in the South Pacific or South China Sea, and I could get the U.S. Navy to use their sonar to go help me find a plane. So, those are the kinds of experiences, the satellite systems, the classified IT stuff we're doing right now. It is fun stuff, and we're way ahead, working with MIT and working with Lincoln Labs and everything else. So if you haven't thought of a federal career, I would highly recommend it. And just the job site is usajobs.gov.
This is an unpaid advertisement.
Yes. Unpaid, yes. And the CIA is CIA.gov and NSA.gov, and you can go online and do a lot of research. And there's analyst positions, and there's pilot positions, and there's accountants and lawyers and everything else. So it's a good place to kind of start and take some looks at.
Yeah. That's a great point, that a lot of times, business students, you think corporate, right? But you have great examples here of government, public sector, and, trade associations, corporate, private.
It's probably
NGOs.
It's going to be a little bit difficult to, just out of grad school, to go abroad. Most organizations want you to have some foundation in what they do before they send you, but I would be very clear on your resume that I want to go abroad. And again, if you can say, I don't care where, and you take the hard assignments that nobody else wants, you will advance much faster.
Yeah. And I would say, it might have been a fluke for me, but I just went out there and offered a deal. I'll work anywhere you want in a place that you need me to be in America, where I can speak the language and I have proven I can survive.
And you get great
et cetera.
experience.
Right. And then take me overseas and be flexible. And you don't know, somebody could do it. Just pick an organization that actually can fulfill that that promise when you get to the end of it.
And I think we talked earlier before the panel started, and I think your interest one day is to be an entrepreneur.
Absolutely,
So I think what would be very useful and applicable later is in your early years when you start working, make sure it would be helpful for you to be in an organization where you can build a lot of contacts, international and US, but certainly international. Because what that means is that when you're ready to start, besides having the experience, you have contacts and you have networks. So you're not starting new by saying, now I want to be an entrepreneur. You will have people you could call, you could reach out to. So I think that would be helpful for later on what you're really interested or wanting to do.
Yeah. And one other point, when you're doing your resume, brand yourself as much as possible with any type of international skills that you have. You can't put proficient in whatever language at the bottom, the last line. You really have to reposition who you are and what you have, even if you may or may not get that international assignment overseas, but you want to begin to position yourself as having a global mindset and having acquired international skills already, including the 2 great assignments that you mentioned.
Thank you very much.
I think there's some questions over here, too.
Oh, yes.
I don't want this part of the room to get left out, because it's all happening over this part of the room.
Yeah, how about her on that side of the room?
All right. Good evening. Good evening, everybody. My name is Nikki Fan. Well, I'm a co-founder of Jackbean, which is based in Taiwan. And our new platform is going to teach you Mandarin, and then going to be a demo on Thursday in the Maori Center. So in order to do international business, I guess Mandarin gonna be pretty important for you. So if you are interested in Mandarin or in doing any funny, because the demo is gonna be a lot of fun, because we wanna show you a lot of things about Mandarin, about the difference between Mandarin and English. So if you are interested, but please come to Maori Center, because I forgot the room, because my coworker gonna do it. And then, if you are interested, please contact me, and then I will give you the detail about my platform. Okay. All right, so my question will be...
good. We were going to cut you off.
Sorry about that. So my question will be, because I know I'm doing the startups things, and then I know the startup host a phase that to change exchange rules, which is... it's even tough when it comes to the international business. So I guess I might ask for advice or any experience to share about a startup a woman in a startup, especially in an international business?
The easiest piece is you have to, whatever your startup is in, you've got to be proficient. You have to have something that's of value and have confidence and be able to sell it. But frankly, I think women, we're great communicators. Go for it.
Yeah, I think there's another thing. Depending on where you're looking, different countries are actually offering different types of, you can write grants. Startup Chile has a great one where you can actually write in, for grant money, and they give you money over a certain amount of years. You work with other entrepreneurs, and you begin to develop a business that way. But a lot of that's cropping up all over, but you really have to do your research. But a lot of countries, governments are offering those kinds of things. Okay, way back there in front of the camera.
Hi, my name is Laura Zambrano. I work at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services in their Office of Global Affairs. So another shameless plug, there's another U.S. agency out there where you can do some international work. And I just had a question. I work, of course, in public health, and so my field is actually, I would say, dominated by women, which is a wonderful thing. So I haven't had to face that same challenge that women in so many other fields have to face. But for me, working in sub-Saharan Africa, one challenge that I have found is the cultural challenge. And I remember my first business trip, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, getting off the plane in Ethiopia and going to this big multilateral conference and thinking, how am I going to speak to these people who look at me now as the foreigner and who they themselves have far much more experience than me? How am I going to be able to engage with them on the same level, and how am I going to be able to establish credibility for myself? So I was curious to see if you had that same sort of moment when you first went abroad, and exactly how you dealt with it, because I think it could be also really helpful. It would have been really helpful to me if somebody had given me a little pep talk before my before my first trip. So.
I'll give a very quick story. So when I was going to Russia, I was actually going to co-lead a contract that was going to be the largest privatization and economic reform public education program ever. And to be completely honest, I didn't even know what privatization was. And when I did the interview, that's serious, I should have taken economics and math and whatever. And if I had advice, go back to business school, okay? Make sure you go to business school if you want to be in business. It'll always help you out. But what was very interesting was and so when they interviewed me, they said, but you're not an economist, you're not a lawyer, you're setting up capital markets in Russia. What do you think you're going to add? And I said, well, see, here's the thing. You guys have a ton of economists and lawyers and everything. They all know that stuff. I said, what your problem is you don't know anybody who actually understands what Russian people, who you are aiming this, multi-million-dollar public education campaign, what they understand. And I said, so what I know is how to run communication campaigns in multimedia around the world. I said, so what I'm going to do is if I can understand in English the education and communication messages that we are going to have to deliver to the Russians, then I know we've got something that's actually going to be able to do something for them. So you all know all the information. I'll get the information from you, but I'm going to be able to craft a message that is simple enough that if I get it, I know they have a chance to get it. And it was really interesting because they all said, wow, you know something? That is what we've been getting wrong. They were talking way above the heads of most people doing this, right down to the point that we had to hire camels and puppet trains and whatever, because there are no ways to do this, right? I said, you got nomadic peoples out in this is 11 time zones, you got nomadic peoples out there. How are you going to talk to these people? We created soap operas, we did camel trains, we did puppet shows, we did whatever, because that's how you could explain in a barter economy what the creation of a capital market and privatization was actually about. So I took a weakness, I fully admitted it, I believe you've always got to be honest. Everybody's got strengths, you got to own up to what you don't know. I'm a very quick study, I read intensely, so I read the entire privatization manual on the plane. I got off. I didn't say I was an expert, but I knew enough conceptually to be able to review the work of others who were the experts and to be able to run that, and we hit our targets and we closed out voucher privatization. Now, what's happened since, we could talk about that in the next 27 hours, but it is really helpful that I took something that everybody said, you're crazy, you have no shot at that. And because I owned up to it and could explain the other unique value that I did have that nobody else on the team had, and I got the job.
I skipped over you before. Switching to the other side.
My name is Maria. And I'm a graduating senior in 46 days I'll be graduating.
Congratulations. But who's counting?
I'll be joining Ernst & Young after graduation as a consultant, and I'm 21 years old, and my one question is I want to go abroad. There's no question. I know Spanish. I'm originally from South America. But I wanted to know, is it more important to be, or at least specialize in a certain subject matter for you to go abroad in certain projects? Or do you think it's better for you just to say, I have this language skills, I want to go abroad? Does it take time? Does it take 5 years to be in the firm? And like you said, in Germany, you specialize in a certain subject, and that's why they send you to other projects. So if I can get just a little bit more information about that and your opinions, that would be great.
Maybe I could try that, because I spent 7 years at Ernst & Young. I love Ernst & Young. I would say that even when I first started at PricewaterhouseCoopers, I did come to specialize in a certain thing, so it was custom business process design, but it's not like I came in the door with that. I didn't know anything about that, and I didn't know what I was going to know, and I think if my advice would be is sort of be open to what the process is, and in large organizations like Ernst & Young, there are going to be lots of opportunities to learn lots of things, and I think if you are really good at learning whatever it is you are exposed to and mastering how to apply that in a client service situation, then I think the opportunities to go abroad are going to be numerous. You're going to be in a position where wait, but maybe I don't want to go as often as you want me to go, because there'll be so many opportunities to leverage that other places. So I would say, it'd be interesting to hear what you think, Debbie. I never found that I had to consciously build that competency in order to be eligible for it. I just had to be good at whatever it is I was doing, and the opportunities just came my way left and right.
Absolutely. I agree with Maria 100%. I would say you asked two very specific things. What would be more important is absolutely express your interest. And these days, I believe in all of Big Four firms, certainly KPMG. When you start, when you feel your goals, what you want to achieve, and they assign you mentors and they assign you kind of performance reviewers, there are places absolutely to put in, your interest to go abroad, even where your language skills, even just relocation within the U.S. So that opportunity is there, number one. If you express it, people will know. If you, and just, time to time when you talk to people, it doesn't have to be people you're working directly with, remind them or mention it to them. Secondly, as Maria said, it's not that you need to specialize in something specific, certainly not at the beginning of your career, but what's more important is you want to build up your credibility. So you want to be a good performer. Firms, of course, just like in any organization, they want to invest in people who they think have potential, have the interest, they want to retain and continue to develop you. So if you do a good job, if you give good performance, that's much, much more important than say, I'm very good at this very esoteric subject, so maybe, down the road, that will be applicable. I think you also asked in terms of kind of timing. Typically, at least in a Big Four accounting firm environment, so for instance, I think I said earlier, I went abroad as a third year, so a first year senior, and that's typically still when firms first support you to go. And I would say that's a good time because in your first couple of years, you may have opportunities and they're kind of short-term projects or there are maybe short-term needs, etc. But if you want to do kind of a rotation, 18 months, 2 years, they like to wait at least you have some experience. They know that you're at least somewhat committed to the firm, so they're not, they just hired you 6 months later. They send you to some fabulous place that you choose, and then afterwards you don't come back. So they do want to make sure there's some initial investments there. I also think another thing is, doesn't matter what stage in your career you're at, you could go as a third year, you could go as a first year senior, you could go as a manager, you could go as a partner. It will bring different things to you and you will have different things to add to that experience. So it's always going to be there. And since we did have some recruiting pitches, I recruit a lot as well, but I'm not saying it for KPMG, but it's true. What I always say is, imagine, an organization or a firm where literally if there's a worldwide map in front of you and you close your eyes and you just throw a dart, anywhere it lands, if you want to go there, we can get you there. And that's really amazing. So if you're joining Ernst & Young, that's certainly one such organization. So I think, express your interest and it's going to come.
So I have to just say, we can get you there with Oreos. I mean, if everybody's going to plug, come on.
Okay, so we've reached, it's a minute past 8, but I would like to ask each of our panelists before we wrap up to just give one short
tidbit piece of advice that maybe we didn't cover tonight? Tammy?
Can we start at the other end?
The loquacious one?
Okay. I'll be quick. I'll be very quick then. So bottom line is I firmly believe you can have it all, but you can't have it at the same time. Chunk out your life, chunk out your career, figure out every year I pick 3 priorities only. 3 is my magic number, okay? Pick what matters to you most at that point. Find some point in your life where international fits in.
I would say be open to opportunities. Sometimes I'm very myopic and I'll be doing something and somebody will come in my office and offer something and I might be looking down a path and you need to kind of pause because opportunities sometimes don't come along that often and you just have to be open to whatever it might be. So sometimes we're so goal-oriented and so like I want to go to Chile that somebody comes in and offers you something else and you're like, well, that's not what I wanted. Right. So just don't be overly goal-oriented. Have a roadmap, but be open to possibilities and other options.
That's life, right?
Yeah.
Debbie?
It really is.
Right. I know at the beginning Stacie mentioned about just the importance of having mentors. So I think I would like to bring that back to that. You know, whether it's going international or even just in everyday career and life, it's just so important to have mentors. So I think it's nice for everyone if you can hopefully, whether it's naturally or even proactively, seek out people that you feel like you could either look up to or bounce things off. And it may be different people for different topics, but I think it's very important to have mentors. And as you consider international careers or just international travel, relocation, having people who have either been there, done that, or who understands what it takes to get there, that's very helpful. And then the only other thing I will say is don't be afraid to ask. You know, what's the worst thing people can say to you?
Exactly.
No. And guess what? That's where you started. You absolutely lost nothing. Yep. So don't be afraid to just ask.
Great piece of advice.
I have nothing to add to any of that, but I would say, just go for it. Sometimes you can actually plan too much, which is what Mary's point is, and you have to be open. And also, if we're talking about the future, who knows where the future is going to lead you? You don't want to pigeonhole yourself. So, you don't want to specialize too much because, the markets develop in very unexpected ways. So I think be open-minded, do the homework, try to prepare yourself as much as you can, but don't, get too bogged down in that I've got to be perfectly set up and I can present myself as the perfect package, because you won't be.
Great.
And just sort of a slight variation on that, I would say, and I have said this to quite a few young people who've come in through my offices, wherever that happens to be, so you don't have to necessarily be anxious about what the entire journey looks like. I think there's a lot of anxiety around making sure that every step leads to the next perfect step and knowing it right from the beginning. I started in consulting, I wasn't planning on it. If I hadn't done consulting, I wouldn't have gone into risk advisory. If I hadn't been doing this particular thing in risk advisory, I wouldn't have gone into entrepreneurship. Without experience in entrepreneurship, Ernst & Young, I wouldn't have gone into the NGO space. And from the start when I was at Penn, I always wanted to do economic development, and I felt like to be practical, I had to do something that was more, to be perfectly honest, lucrative, something more stable. And many years later, 10 years later, I found my way back. But I couldn't have planned that journey, and little did I know that every step got me closer to that without me planning it. So don't worry so much about the whole journey. Make sure the one you're in is really good, and maybe plan for the next one, and that's probably all you really need to do.
Wow, they make it so easy. Then the only piece of advice I want to give you is when you're negotiating that first job abroad, make sure you've talked to some people who've actually done expat contracts before, because going overseas for the first time, you don't know what to ask for. You don't know that everybody else on your team is going to get housing, a driver, a bunch of things that you didn't know to ask for. So just make sure you're well informed, and again, go for it. It's an incredible ride.
And I would add one more, which is give back, which is, of course, the topic of this. Give back, invest in others, and it actually comes back to you manifold. So thank you very much for being a wonderful audience.
Thank you.
To our great panelists.
Good question.
I wish I had time for drinks.